grades, English language arts. After I left the classroom, I went to work for the state affiliate of the National Education Association in North Carolina. It's called NCAE. And I went to work there as a lobbyist at the General Assembly, advocating for policies that would support public education in that state. I did that for a few years. And then in 2002, that same position came open here in South Carolina for our affiliate called the SCEA. I applied for it and amazingly was, though I knew nothing about South Carolina, was hired to come down here. I think they said, oh, this is going to be entertaining. So let's have him come down here. And so I came here and went to work in 2003 that was Mark Sanford's first year as governor. Went to work at the General Assembly lobbying. And it did not take very long for me to understand that I didn't know very much about South Carolina's history in public education and public policy affecting public schools. And at every turn, I would have conversations with legislators and ask, how did we get to this point? This is so radically different from the way that things are in North Carolina. And whether the conversations were short or long, the conversation would always bring us back to the period that we'll cover in conversation this evening. And I did this work for 3 or 4 years and then went to work at NEA, where I get to do this kind of work across the South. So from the North Carolina border all the way down to Florida, all the way west to Texas and Oklahoma, and back to West Virginia. All of the states in that area has been my region for the last 20 plus years. And I've enjoyed very much getting to work with educators. However, what I have learned about the state of education in all of those states always has been an echo of what happened here in South Carolina, which just underscores the importance of South Carolina, not just in public education, but in the history of the United States. I have developed this theory of my own that I've shared with Brett and other classes of the Modjeska School, that South Carolina has served as an incubator for bad ideas, that it propagates out to other states across the country and watches them grow into a garden of all sorts of badness. All right, now let me see. So when we talk about this period, you'll see the title here is Massive Resistance. And I'll feature Jimmy Burns and Marion Gressett and the Rise of the Christian Coalition in our conversation this evening, because all of them have a part to play in this period. When we talk about massive resistance, what I mean by this specifically are the actions undertaken to resist implementation of several Supreme Court rulings of the 1940s and 50s that expanded civil rights to all Americans, not just in public education, and to resist implementation of several federal laws enacted during the 1960s to achieve the same goal. My own area of experience and expertise pertains to public education, as I mentioned, so most of the presentation will focus there. If massive resistance had a message to deliver, it was this. This was the message. The state of South Carolina, you'll see it on the screen, is willing to do anything, pay anything, change anything, even abandon anything in order to preserve the order of segregated white supremacy. You're going to see this line come back again. If you want to take notes as I go, that's fine. But this is a long period of time, and I'm going to move at a pretty good clip. What I'll present here this evening begins with how the state's government led the way into massive resistance with legal and legislative strategies in the 1950s, then pivoted to social and non-governmental strategies in the 1960s, and then saw its efforts take on lives of their own in religious and business organizations in the 1970s that still hold power today. Not all of these developments were born in South Carolina. Most of them were. A couple, I will mention, were conceived here, but were born elsewhere. You'll see that at almost every step of the way, South Carolinians were either leaders or thought partners in these strategies of massive resistance. To set the stage for massive resistance to public school integration in the 50s, I need to share 5 facts with you. In 1941, Governor Burnett Maybank commissioned a study that showed 19 counties lacked a high school for Black students. There are only 46 counties in South Carolina. 19 of them did not have a high school for Black students. Only 8 buses, this is in 41 now, carried Black children to school statewide. Governor Burnett Maybank did nothing to address these disparities. He knew that they existed. The legislature knew they did nothing. In 1947, 6 years later, Governor Strom Thurmond and the legislature commissioned another statewide survey, this one completed by the George Peabody College for Teachers. This is a prestigious institution in Nashville, Tennessee, and overseen by Dr. J.B. White, who had been a superintendent in South Carolina. The data that was surfaced in that study showed that South Carolina spent $221 per white pupil, but only $45 per Black pupil in South Carolina. Very few schools had been built since World War II, and you can guess who attended those newer schools. Rural schools were even worse off than urban schools were, with variable electric service, variable plumbing, and of course, fewer teachers in those schools. In October 1948, the Peabody study was released. It detailed differences, what it called, quote, extreme disparity in funding, in transportation, in teacher training, and school facilities in these segregated schools. The Peabody report called for an investment, remember this number, of $19 million to improve school building facilities and bring schools closer to the national average in school buildings and equipment. But Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, in 1948, when Dr. Green just told you about what he did at the convention and thereafter, did nothing to address the Peabody study that he had commissioned. He had asked for this. Of course, that summer, as Dr. Green told you, he left the Democratic Party left the Democratic Party convention in Philadelphia in protest of the National Party's civil rights platform. He declared, this is a quote, that all the laws of Washington and all the bayonets of the army cannot force the Negro into our homes, our schools, our churches, and our places of recreation. He said this in 1948. Instead, he and other Southern Democrats held a States Rights Party convention in Birmingham just a few weeks later, and that convention nominated him to run as a Dixiecrat against Harry S. Truman. Keep in mind, Dixiecrat, not Republican. He left the convention in 1948 to become what he called a Dixiecrat. He didn't flip parties. He didn't switch parties to become a Republican just yet. This effectively split Southern Democrats, et cetera. So when we talk about how and when the political poles reversed, this is a topic of conversation even today, how it used to be that Democrats were this and Republicans were that, but now Democrats are that and Republicans are this. So when we talk about how the poles reverse in political polarity, that conservatives once owned the Democratic Party before they owned the Republican Party, this was the first step in that reversal. Finally, in 1950, the state House developed a minor study of its own. 1950. Now, it heard what the Peabody report said in 1948. 2 years later, it sort of puts the Peabody study on the shelf, commissions its own minor study, looking for a way to minimize costs that had been identified by Peabody. The legislature had not supported sales tax in the past, but in its report, State House leaders suggested that they might, keyword might, support a small, keyword small, tax increase to fund limited, keyword limited school improvements. And then Jimmy Burns was elected in November. Now, we've talked a little bit about Jimmy Burns already, but let's review quickly who he was and how he got to where he got to. He was a cousin to former South Carolina Governor Miles B. McSweeney. He had been funded by a financier from Camden, whose name was Bernard Baruch. If you're not familiar with Bernard Baruch, I know that it looks like Bernard Baruch. Bernard Baruch is how he pronounced it, how he preferred to pronounce it. He wrote it in his own book. He preferred to be called Bernard Baruch. Okay. Wealthy financier, in part because he predicted the stock market crash of 1929 and pulled a bunch of his money out of the stock market. So he was insulated. He loved picking winners in politics, and he identified Jimmy Burns early on. So he benefited from being McSweeney's cousin because that got him into the legal profession, and he benefited from being a friend of Bernard Baruch. Baruch is best known for having purchased down on the coast in Horry County and Georgetown County something called the Hobcaw Barony. If you've ever taken a vacation down there, Bernard Baruch and his family bought that and developed it to the extent that it was developed. Baruch had been a confidant of President Woodrow Wilson, and that's what gave him entree into the federal government so long ago. He had chaired, as a matter of fact, during World War I, Baruch had chaired Wilson's War Industries Board, funding the world of the Great War. He was one of the wealthiest men in America, Baruch was. So it was his advice that had made Jimmy Burns wealthy early on, just being a country lawyer from South Carolina. He became extremely wealthy very early. And then he got elected to the Congress, thanks to Baruch. He got elected to the U.S. Senate. You'll see there in 1941 and 42, not for the whole 2-year period, but just slightly more than 1 year across that period. Franklin Roosevelt asked Jimmy Burns, would you please step out of the Senate and take a position on the U.S. Supreme Court during a period when court rulings had been going against Roosevelt's New Deal. So this was part of his court packing scheme. He added some justices to the Supreme Court, and Jimmy Burns was one. However, after less than 2 years, only more than 1 year, he asked Burns to come off of the Supreme Court and come over to the White House to run the Office of Economic Stabilization and then the Office of War Mobilization, essentially doing for him during World War II what Bernard Baruch had done for Woodrow Wilson during World War I. And then, of course, from 45 to 47, Burns was U.S. Secretary of State for Truman until their relationship never was really warm and fuzzy, but then they had a falling out, and so Burns stepped out as Secretary of State and came home. So he came home in 47. Yes, Brett.
I just want to point out that Burns was Secretary of State at an incredibly important time for the Alta Conference, and he was really the one that was negotiating with Molotov and all those. And Burns, as we move on down the time here, we'll talk more about Burns' vicious anti-communism for reasons that need to be talked about.
It was notable that while he had served in the Senate, he was instrumental in blocking a federal anti-lynching law. An anti-lynching law at the federal level was proposed and debated. He blocked it. Didn't want it to pass. And although he supported Roosevelt's court packing plan and left his Senate seat for a seat on the court, his tenure, Jimmy Burns' tenure, is the shortest of any associate justice on the Supreme Court in history. Shortest. All right. I'm sorry. So he comes back in 1947 to home, South Carolina. He's out of office for the first time since 1911. He has served in the legislative branch, he served in the judiciary, and he served in the executive branch. He served in all three branches of government. The last person to have done that was nobody.
He was also a county. He had all the county seats.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes. So he had done what no South Carolinian, not even John C. Calhoun, had done, because Calhoun had served in the legislature, in the Senate, and in the executive branch, but not in the judiciary. All right. In 1951, he is inaugurated. In January, he's inaugurated. Now, because he had been such a creature of the government for most of his adult life, and because he had served in the judiciary and served in the executive branch, not only in the legislative branch, Jimmy Burns was one of the smartest politicos that South Carolina has produced. And so he could see around the corner what was coming. His friends and contacts in the judiciary suggested to him what was going to happen in the cases that wound up becoming Brown versus Ford. And so when he came into office, he came in fifth gear. There was no learning curve for Jimmy Burns. Within days of his inauguration, he outlined his strategy to issue bonds for school construction and to issue a 3-cent sales tax to pay for these bonds. All of which, there was a strategy here, all of which was designed to defend and preserve segregation in public schools. He wanted to be able to make the case he wanted our segregation's attorneys to be able to make the case to the Supreme Court. There's no need to overturn segregation in public accommodations in public schools. See, we're investing all kinds of money to bring our schools up to separate but equal. And what Burns asked of the legislature, he got. He made no secret of his motives. When he requested this of the legislature, he asked, here's a name you'll recognize, Fritz Hollings, the Speaker pro tem of the South Carolina House at that time, to deliver for him in the House. And over in the Senate, he asked Senate Education Chairman, Senator Marion Gressett, to deliver his plan in the Senate. So first it was the equalization plan. Black parents in Clarendon County had filed litigation to address funding disparities in their schools. He saw this as a threat that neither Maybank nor Thurmond in 41 and 47 had faced. And he said that to the South Carolina Education Association back when it was the all-white association, only a few weeks into his administration. And that was based only on their request for equal transportation expenditures. That was based only on their request for as many school buses as white kids got, before they changed the brief to challenge the constitutionality of separate but equal. Burns saw that coming. So he said South Carolina had to show that it would address, and it was addressing, the inequity in funding for and the number of and the quality of public schools for Black students. His intention, he stated it out loud, was to prevent an adverse court decision. He made no secret of this. This is the thing. He said it out loud to reporters. Our intention is to prevent an adverse court decision in Briggs v. Elliott. He wanted to provide evidence that separate but equal was valid as public policy. So he asked, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead of myself. He asked in February and March the legislature to pass the $75 million, keep that in mind, $75 million bond issue for school equalization and a 3-cent sales tax to pay for school construction and pay off the bonds. Now, what had the Peabody study recommended? $90 million. He's only asking for 75. So what he's asking for is insufficient to accomplish everything that Peabody said had to be done. And yet, this was an unprecedented commitment of funding for public schools. Well, it was immediately unpopular with the public, all of the public. White leaders opposed paying to educate Black children. They said they didn't want new schools unless the court ordered it, if the court ordered it. Black and white citizens asked for food and clothes to be made tax exempt. If you're going to pass a sales tax, at least don't put it on food and clothes. Black citizens specifically opposed the tax because it was a response to Briggs v. Elliott litigation. So the public hated this idea. Burns faced an uphill climb with lawmakers. Lawmakers go back home and they hear from their constituents. They say, it's too big. This plan is too big. It's too expensive. It has too much emphasis on Black children. Equalization was not their legislative priority because they were not persuaded by his prediction that legal segregation itself was in danger. In responding to these lawmakers and the public, so he went further than any other governor had. South Carolina, as Brett has mentioned before, is always in the lead, and it was in the lead in this case as well. He pledged publicly, listen to this, that if the legislature implemented his plan and the courts ignored this demonstration of good faith in defense of separate but equal, and if the court ultimately declared that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, then he would lead the legislature in abandoning the constitutional mandate to provide for public schooling altogether. Keep in mind, the Constitution of 1868 established public education in the Constitution for the first time. So that's the context here. There's a constitutional requirement that the state will provide for public schools. He says, oh, come on, y'all. If y'all will just go with me here, raise the $75 million, buy these equalization bonds, raise the sales tax, and even then, if the court rules against us and overturns separate but equal, I'll be the one to lead us to overturn the constitutional provision for public schools, and we'll do away with public education. Then, just as he predicted, the Clarendon County parents changed their petition, no longer just asking for school buses, but to have separate but equal overturned. That change gave Burns the ammunition he needed to persuade the House and Senate leaders to do as he asked. Now we get to April, same spring. 1 month before the 3-judge panel began hearing the arguments in Briggs v. Elliott in May, the legislature passed his equalization proposal. And 1 week later, this brand new Educational Finance Commission, freshly appointed to administer these equalization funds, met for the first time. This was all done lickety-split fast. The sales tax wouldn't become effective until July 1, but this commission began meeting to show that it was serious. We're serious about this, about equalizing schools for little Black children. Clarendon County's attorney, Robert M. Figg, F-I-G-G, built this news into his defense arguments in real time in court. Now, throughout Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, if Franklin Roosevelt needed something done, he turned to his assistant president, Jimmy Burns. Well, fast forward a decade, Jimmy Burns is the governor of South Carolina. He needs an assistant governor. And he looks around, and the most powerful man he can find in the Senate is Marion Gresset, senator from Calhoun County. So he asks Marion Gresset, will you lead this effort for me in the Senate to help me protect segregation in South Carolina? Now, Gresset was already a titan in South Carolina politics at the time. If you're not familiar with his name, it's a shock and a surprise. You should be. Everybody should be more aware of him. He was the chair of the Education Committee. He was soon to be the chair of the Judiciary Committee. That's the committee that appoints judges in South Carolina, including Supreme Court judges. The soon to be elected chairman of the state Democratic Party over the whole shooting gallery. So saying that Burns wanted Gresset to be Burns's own Jimmy Burns is an apt analogy when you consider the assignments that Burns had given to Gresset and the assignments that Gresset accepted. So in the opening months of his term, he devised the second half, Burns did, of his two-track plan. One track was this economic plan to equalize school funding, but the other track was a legal strategy to protect segregation through separate but equal, and to resist court orders through statute. Burns said he wanted Gresset to serve as the point man on both the economic track and the legal track. He intended to create and appoint a 15-member Special School Study Committee, SSSC. You don't have to remember SSSC, just remember the Segregation Commission. That's all you need to remember. Or the Gresset Committee. It's a private council, a quasi-legislative council, quasi because it included some legislators, but it also included some business leaders. Now, 15 years down the road, when some litigation is filed, you'll understand why it's significant that this was a quasi-legislative committee when you find out they never kept any minutes of any of their meetings. Okay, so he said, I want you to chair it, Marion Gresset. To illustrate how badly he wanted Marion Gresset to chair this committee, the Special School Study Committee, at the same moment that he appointed Marion to run it, he appointed this fellow named Tatum Gresset, the first executive director of South Carolina's brand new consolidated retirement system. So public employees, whether you were a state employee or you were a municipal employee, before this era, had no retirement. And so organizations like, for example, the SCEA had fought for 20 some years to create a pension plan for public employees and state and municipal employees. They finally succeeded. So it exists now in 1951. It's brand new. And to lead it, the first person that he picks is this fellow named Tatum Gresset. And not only was Tatum the first executive director of the state retirement council, the state retirement system for public employees, he also named him the state agent for the Social Security Administration. Now think about this. We've just learned in the last year or so that DOJ up in Washington, D.C. has scrubbed the federal government of everybody's data, all of your personal data, and given it over to this company, this AI company, Palantir, out on the West Coast. Well, in 1951, putting Tatum Gresset in charge of the state retirement system that had personal information for every state and municipal worker, but also the state agent for the Social Security Administration, meant that any adult who had a working record with the federal government, earning Social Security benefits, Tatum Gresset had his fingers on it. Now, you may say to yourself, he must have been highly qualified. Let me tell you what Tatum's qualifications were. Back in the 19-teens and 20s, he had been a football player and a coach at the Citadel. He had been a coach at the Citadel in the 1920s and 30s. He had effectively retired a decade earlier in the early 1940s. He was no more qualified to assume the role of state agent for the Social Security Administration and executive director of the state retirement system than I am. Yet he got it. Why? Because Burns wanted Marion Gressett, and Marion Gressett said, my brother's got to have a little taste too. And so Burns gave him a little taste. Marion Gressett accepted Burns's offer. So for the next 15 years, the Special School Study Committee became known as the Segregation Committee or the Gressett Committee. It functioned as a legislative committee. It produced draft legislation for introduction in the General Assembly with one important difference, and I've already alluded to that. I'll cover it in a few minutes. So in June of 1951, a lot of things happened. Defense attorney Robert Figg wins the Briggs v. Elliott case down in Manning, at the Manning Courthouse in Clarendon County. Wins it at the district level. It's a 3-judge panel. He wins 2 judges, and the dissent is written by Judge Julius Wades Waring. One of the 2 prevailing judges was George Bell Timmerman Sr., whose son, George Bell Timmerman Jr., would be elected governor in just another 2 or 3 years. The one dissent, of course, came from Judge Waring. He argued that it was long past time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. He wrote, segregation is per se inequality. And you already know that the Briggs appeal and 4 similar cases were rolled into one larger case, which the Supreme Court agreed to hear. The name of that would be the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, if you read through your study guide this past week in prep for tonight, you'll know that when cases like this from states are rolled into one big case, you normally name them by alphabetical order. Now, my 6th grade students, way back when I was teaching English language arts, know that Briggs comes before Brown if you're going by alphabetical order. But they didn't call it the Briggs v. Elliott case. They called it Brown versus Board of Education. Why? Because of your friend and mine, Governor Jimmy Burns, who did not want South Carolina's name to be associated with what may come to pass in 2 or 3 more years. You see here the announcement in the Greenville newspaper that Burns has named a study group. It's just called a study group. We're just studying things, right? And you see here who's on this study group. Named to the Segregation Study Committee, Miller Foster of Spartanburg, George Warren of Hampton, Wayne Freeman of Greenville, Creighton Frampton of Charleston, George D. Levy of Sumter. What do you notice about them? They're all men, and they're all white men too. There's no pictures, but you know who they are. Legislative members already named include Gressett from Calhoun, Jeffries of Colleton, Bryant of Orangeburg, these are all senators, Dorsey Librand of Aiken, Arentz of Kershaw. Named from the House, Howard Bean from Spartanburg. Notice where he's pulling from, parts of the state that he's pulling from. Harold King of Oconee, Owens from Lawrence, Underway of Pickens, and John H. Williams of Aiken. Then he names Mrs. I don't understand why. I've not been able to find this out. Mrs. Benton R. O'Neill of Greenville, G. McMaster Ketchum of Winsboro, and Herbert Smith to the committee to study mental health facilities. So the woman on the segregation committee is just there to study mental health facilities, et cetera. And you see the rest of those details.
Did their studies include the fact that that war they fought not that long before that? It didn't end well for them?
No, I don't think that came up because they were reading the Oliphant book, Mary Sims Oliphant, a history textbook. All right, here we go. In June of 1951, Gressett defends the segregation policy, and look at the key. Now he's speaking here to the teachers of South Carolina. He speaks to them at the South Carolina Employees Association at its annual meeting here. I'm sorry, not the teachers, but the Employees Association. And look at the key quote here. The races must be kept separate. Every dime derived from this sales tax will be spent on education. He says, he termed it the only salvation for the boys and the girls of our state. Well, there are black boys and black girls of our state too. He wasn't including them in his assessment here. Now, if you want someone who offered the exact opposite of this point of view, look at this fellow. In January of 1952, Judge Wades Waring submits his letter to President Harry Truman announcing that he is going to exercise his option to take senior status. Once you're appointed to a federal judgeship, that's an appointment for life, right? But when you reach a certain age, you can, if you choose, take senior status, which really means that you're semi-retired from the bench. You don't have to hear cases anymore if you don't want to, but you keep your title, and importantly, you keep your salary. And so therefore, you don't have to go to work every day, et cetera. He sends Harry Truman a letter in January. He lets him know, I intend to take senior status effective February 15th. And he might have included, because I haven't seen in the letter, he may have included a note to say, by the way, Harry, I've decided, my wife and I have decided to leave Charleston. We're going to move up to New York City where things are nicer. He gives an interview to the New York Times. And in this particular clip, this was published on February the 24th, but the interview was actually on February the 5th. And in it, look at the quotes. He says, to this New York Times reporter, knowing it's going to be published, knowing it will be copied and reprinted elsewhere, he says it'll be nice to get away from narrow provincialism. This is a federal judge from South Carolina, right? And then these two beautiful quotes. No one would dare back me. He said after he issued his dissent, he got hundreds of letters from people, Southerners, saying, I agree with you privately, but I can't say that in public. I just want you to know I agree with you privately. He said no one would dare back me openly because he would be ruined socially and possibly financially. In the South, this is just crystal, isn't it? To advocate the abolition of segregation is the unforgivable sin. And if you deny white supremacy, you're damned. Now, what did Gressett say just 6 months earlier? Gressett said the races must be kept separate. He said it's the only salvation for the boys and girls of our state. But Waring says, if you can have this integration starting with the little children in the first grades, you will get rid of racial prejudice. Two completely opposite points of view. In 1950, the 1 and 2 equalization plan, here are some of the results of it. It forced counties to consolidate schools and districts. I'll tell you a little bit more detail about this. The state's brand new, I told you it was brand new, Education Finance Commission oversaw these changes and applications. It forced counties to consolidate schools and districts. It eliminated local school boards that had fewer than 7 members. There were a lot of them. And it ordered the survey of building and educational needs of these schools, and then it instructed local school boards to apply for school funding. By October 1942, 42 districts had submitted plans for consolidation, replacing old boards with fewer new boards. Keep in mind, South Carolina has only 46 counties, but when the consolidation plans were completed, these plans reduced the number of independent school districts in South Carolina from, this is like one of those Price is Right games, higher, 1,220 school districts. 1,220 school districts in South Carolina, down to 102. Almost every little one-room schoolhouse in South Carolina, at every little crossroads, at every little end of the road, had its own school board, was its own school district. Every school, every different school was its own school district.
I mean, if that goes back to a time before automobiles and mass transit, I would imagine that you needed more for community involvement.
It could be so, yes, it could be so. You could argue that. All of this remained unpopular. Local school boards resented losing local control.
Yep.
This phrase that keeps coming back. Over school construction in their counties. Rural white parents resented consolidation because it meant their children will have to ride the bus a little bit further. The plan was undermined purposefully in some of these districts. Remember, local officials had to survey and report their own school needs to this Education Finance Commission in Columbia, and some of them built schools for Black children, but they underreported the need for space and equipment. So in Saluda, just as one example, a full wing of 12 classrooms was excluded from a school that was intended to be built for Black students. In Charleston, a second example, one Black high school was closed and administrators refused to build a new one to replace it. So massive resistance became sort of a game. And this is only in 1952, became a game. The EFC, Education Finance Commission, stopped funding applications for only white school projects if the district had not also submitted a plan for a Black school project. So some school districts like Lee County didn't ask for funding for 2 full years after it was available. There's plenty of money here for you, Lee County. They said, if we got to submit a plan for a black school too, no, no. So other districts responded by applying for funds to build black schools, but then they cut funding for other needs like local allotments for teacher salaries. And then in 1952, remember what Jimmy Burns had said? I'll be the one to lead the way if the court goes against us to undo the constitutional requirement for public schools. And so what happens? The legislature puts the question on the ballot. And the question doesn't say, do you want to do away with the constitutional provision? What the question says is, if the court rules against us, will you authorize the legislature to take this out of the Constitution? And you see the results here. The referendum passed by more than 2-1, with almost 188,000 votes cast. It was 129,003 to 58,010. This meant the legislature had the authority beginning in 1953 to close public schools statewide if and when it chose to do so. Did y'all know this? That the legislature was given by a referendum the authority to do this. I didn't until I started studying this. This is why it fascinates me. So you know what happens in May of 1954. Brown versus Board of Education ruling comes out. Segregation is per se inequality. Who said that? Waring said that in Briggs v. Elliott. And massive resistance begins on a formal scale. Now, remember what I told you. South Carolina is a leader in all these things. Other states, Virginia had been doing a little bit, but not on a statewide scale like South Carolina did. Mississippi had been playing around, but Mississippi always plays around. It's just a general fact. Then suddenly all these other southern states realize, oh, wait just a minute. Brown v. Board means we're going to have to immigrate. We've now got to raise some money to build some, what are we going to do? So they're all looking at South Carolina as the model. Burns reacted to the Brown versus Board ruling by halting all equalization building projects and approvals until the state attorney general ruled on the legality of state money supporting schools designated as black or white. See, the law had been that we're building black schools and we're building white schools. But now the court has ruled you can't have black or white schools, you have to have public schools. And so Burns says, no, we're not going to spend another dollar until our state attorney general says we can continue building a school, even though it says black or white. In a rare personal visit to Gressett's segregation commission, Burns predicted that if the court enforced integration of public schools, now this is in 54, this is early, white parents will withdraw their children from public schools and enroll them in private schools. Hint, hint. If the court enforces integration of public schools, y'all, white parents will take their children out of public schools and enroll them in private schools. Did y'all get the hint? Burns cast this as a concern. When you look at it, look at pictures of it. He's so concerned about this. He's earnest. He cast it as a concern that if white parents left these public schools, y'all, tens of millions of tax dollars will have been wasted on this equalization plan. So he continues to promote this equalization plan in public, but wait, did I tell you? Okay, in public, he continues to promote the equalization plan. He tells South Carolinians, we will find a way around this Brown versus Board ruling. We will find legal ways to keep public schools segregated. So in July, 2 months after the ruling comes out, he reinstates the construction projects and work goes on. But Burns and Gressett, between the two of them, theorized, if black parents believe their schools are equal to white schools, then they will continue to support segregation. They will continue to support segregation rather than integration. So long as they gave the NAACP no reason to pursue additional litigation, for example, avoiding any instances where a black child would have to pass by a white school on their way to school in the morning, then they believe black parents would not instigate or support, those were their words, instigate any more interference by the NAACP. And then in November of 1954, keep in mind, in those days, governors were limited to a 1 4-year term of office. You couldn't run for re-election. So by the end of 1954, Burns perceived that he had failed in his primary mission to prevent the Brown v. Board decision, but out of his failure had grown good news and bad news. By the time he left office, the equalization plan had allotted nearly $125 million to build 775 new schools, and 2/3 of those funds went to build schools specifically for Black students. In late 1954, I've caught up now to the slide on the screen. In late 1954, Burns and Gressett went back to lawmakers to increase the original bond, the one that they had passed in 1951, to $137.5 million. The legislature approved it the following year in 1955 after Burns was succeeded by Governor George Bell Timmerman Jr. And that funded another $62 million for school construction. But more bad news followed because of South Carolina. The games that these local school boards had played with equalization applications meant that all these new schools that had been built were insufficient already. They were overcrowded. They planned for and hired too few new teachers. They lacked equipment. In Black school facilities, there weren't libraries and gymnasiums and athletic fields that were equal to the ones in white schools, and nor was the academic curriculum in Black schools, which had been completely overlooked in the equalization plan. Why? Because the equalization plan was about construction, not curriculum, So take a look at this chart. And you'll see there, these were the schools built with the first Equalization Act funding by grade level. You see how many were built in Black elementary schools. Then there was this odd category called elementary and high schools together. I guess that was a full K-12, 1 through 12. They didn't have kindergarten yet. 1 through 12, Black junior high, Black consolidated schools, and Black training schools, what they call training schools, versus white elementary and high, junior, et cetera, et cetera. You see the comparison there. All of this, by the way, is research that was done and compiled by a graduate student named Rebecca Dombrowsko, who it continues to be an education researcher in Texas. And you see here the year by year, how many schools were built out of these equalization funds, all the way up to 1962 in their numbers. Now let's talk about what the segregation committee, that study committee, they were just studying things, what they had been up to all this time. In 1955, the segregation committee issued a report in which it recommended the repeal of a parent's right to send children to school in another district when he pays taxes in the other district. Today, parents play around with getting their student athletes into the high school of their choice, even if it means crossing district lines. Well, things like this happened apparently in those days too, not just for athletic purposes, but for racial purposes. And so if I'm a farmer and I own property across the county line over there, and the closest school to me in my own county is a school where there might be some Black children going, I don't want my kid to go there, so I'm going to send him across over yonder. Well, they repealed a parent's right. What this did was it affected Black parents more than white parents. Repealed a parent's right to send children to school in another county when he paid taxes in that other district. This was one of 7 things that the Segregation Commission had accomplished. They repealed the compulsory attendance law. You know what compulsory attendance law is. It says that a child's got to go to school. Well, we're going to repeal that now. They provided for a visiting teacher, quote unquote, to urge school attendance. We don't have any truant officers. There's no teeth in the truancy policy. We're just going to hire a visiting teacher to urge people to go to school. We granted local school boards additional powers and duties. We repealed the law on school terms. A school term was the school year. How many days do you have to go to school in a school year? Well, there had been a law on that. They undid the law. So now a local school board can decide how long the school year will be and when it will be. They gave local boards the authority to lease or sell. Oh, this is a good one. This is a good one. Remember when Jimmy Burns went to the segregation committee and said, hint, hint, y'all, if we got to integrate, white parents might take their children out and enroll them in private schools, right? Look at number 6. Gave local boards the authority to lease or sell school property to private entities to allow for the private operation of schools. So let's say you got Brett Bursey Elementary School and the Chris Gardner School District school board wants to turn Brett Bursey, because it's going to be an integrated school, wants to turn Brett Bursey Elementary School into an all-white school to protect it, protect segregated status, right? So the local school board in the Gardner School District can say, well, we've decided now to sell the school property or lease the school property for the Bursey Elementary School to a private entity. Let's call it Mr. Walmart. We're going to lease it to a private entity and let this private entity run a private school. It's not a public school anymore. And so therefore, because it's not a public school, it's not subject to public policy, including Supreme Court rulings. See how that works? Then number 7, they abolished the automatic continuation of employment for teachers. It used to be so that if you were hired as a teacher, you could anticipate being hired next year. But now if we've got to keep black teachers on a payroll, let's do away with that. Let's give principals the right to just pick the teachers that he wants to give continuing contracts instead of making it automatic. That segregation committee was creative, y'all. In 1956, the very next year, they kept being creative. The General Assembly adopted a resolution of what they called interposition. Anybody studied John C. Calhoun from a century earlier? John C. Calhoun was the one who had come up with this notion of interposition, putting a state statute in between the people of a state and the federal government. This was a strategy to halt integration of public schools by having at least 1/4 of states to reject the Brown versus Board ruling from the Supreme Court. This was all part of his, by the way, John C. Calhoun's concept of nullification, that if enough states vote to overturn something that's been passed by Congress or a ruling of the Supreme Court, well, we just nullify it. We interpose. Now, I mentioned that not everything comes out of South Carolina. Some things are conceived in South Carolina, but born elsewhere. This is one example. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, in the summer of 1959, it closed its public schools completely. It followed South Carolina's model of doing away with public education altogether. Certain private citizens obtained a charter for the Prince Edward School Foundation. They created a nonprofit foundation to raise money in order that private schools would be available to white children. Now, if you were a black child in Prince Edward County, Virginia, and you wanted to go to a public school, and there are no public schools for you to go to, the state of Virginia said, oh, so sorry, too bad. Do what you can. There might be a library open to you. But for a white child, we got this Prince Edward Foundation that's raising money for a private school, et cetera, et cetera. Such private schools were conducted during the school year of 59 and 60 for white children only. They didn't charge any tuition. How sweet of them. These schools were supported by private contributions. For the school year of 60 and 61, the Prince Edward School Foundation charged a tuition of $240 for its elementary students and $265 for its high school students. In July of 60, the Board of Supervisors of that county adopted an ordinance providing, listen to this, $100, what they call grants in aid. This is tax dollars. I'm sorry. Yes, tax dollars. Grants in aid for the education of any Prince Edward County child whose parent or guardian applied for it, who attended and proposed to attend a school that met the requirements of the ordinance. Well, we got this real nice, pretty private school over here that meets all the requirements of the ordinance. So if you've got a child in that school, come on over here and you can apply for a $100 grant in aid to help fund your child's enrollment at that school. Oh, I'm sorry, black parents. Your children aren't allowed to go to that school because it's the rules of that school. It's a private school. We can't tell the private school what to do. So I don't know what to tell you. So during the school year of 60 and 61, the Prince Edward School Foundation received private contributions in the amount of $200,000, which were credited to its building fund, its library fund, and its operating fund. The treasurer of that county credited as payments on account of county tax bills the sum of $56,000, all of which was contributed to the Prince Edward. So tax dollars from property taxes in that county went to the school foundation. During both of those years, practically all of the white school teachers who formerly taught in the public school system in that county were employed miraculously as teachers of the private school. Isn't that convenient? During the 60 and 61 school year, the foundation schools were accredited by the State Board of Education. So now they can graduate with a good degree, a good diploma. Parents of black students were not dumb. They caught on. and they filed suit. They challenged the constitutionality of this grant in aid tuition tax credit program. And in a minute, I'll tell you what the Supreme Court said. Now, y'all ever heard of Bob Jones? I want to tell you, although this not got to do with schools, except tangentially. On Easter Sunday, April 17 of 1960, Bob Jones, founder and president of Bob Jones University, he preached and he published a sermon called Is Segregation Scriptural? On Easter Sunday. In it, he argued that God is the author of segregation, and therefore integration is sinful. It's sinful. Bow down. Go to your knees. I won't read this. I want very badly to read it for you, but that's all right. In it, he says, if you're against segregation and against racial separation, you are against God Almighty, because he made racial separation in order to preserve the race through which, et cetera, et cetera. He is the author of segregation, et cetera. Now, listen just a minute. You colored people are entitled to good schools. You won't have them. I would like for you to remember something. Just remember that the South went through Reconstruction and had a hard time. It was not easy. It was not easy. Then remember something else too. When your ancestors were slaves in the homes of these Southern people, they got a breath of culture that they could not have gotten, even in the schoolrooms of America. They heard the old time preachers. I've said many times that the greatest preachers who have lived since the apostolic days were the preachers of the South, the preachers who preached to the colored people. And back there, the slaves had the gospel. They heard it and were converted, and they were saved. May God add his blessing to the reading and hearing of this portion. In 1960, now we're transitioning here from the strategies of the 1950s to the strategies of the 1960s. So,
well, wait, the strategy of the 1960s was that God's a white guy?
Yes, typically, yes.
Okay.
Generally speaking. What Brett just said, for those of you in Zoom land, was that in the 1960s, it was decided that God was white. So that covers the state's formal leadership of massive resistance through legal and legislative means from the 1950s. We'll see through the next decade the remnants of those efforts playing out and a new strategy of right-wing community organizing ramping up. So in 60, the General Assembly combined all references to spending state funds for segregated purposes into one section of the budget bill. Now, if you've never lobbied at the State House and been there during the budget season, you may not understand what that means. The budget is a massive document with line item by line item by line item by line item in it. So lawmakers can rise to offer an amendment to delete line item, 430. And then you vote on deleting line item 430. Well, in South Carolina's budget bills, everything that has to do with funding public education might exist from pages 160 all the way down through 220. Because all of these provisions and all of their little descriptions are in that section of the budget bill. By combining all of those line items into one, what it meant was not only can we, with one stroke of the pen, take out the constitutional provision for public schools, but we can eliminate, with one vote, eliminate all funding for public education. So that's the technical reason for this. It also restricted the court's ability to claim jurisdiction on these matters. It required litigants to prove that state laws or courts denied the legislature its authority. If you're going to challenge us, show us in the law where the state legislature doesn't have the authority to do what we intend to do, which puts additional and onerous burden on litigants. All right, let's come back to, anybody heard of Dr. Billy James Hargis? I'm sorry, anybody heard of Billy James Hargis before he was doctor? He was a radio evangelist. You've heard of Billy Sunday, Father Charles Conklin, people like that. These are these right-wing preachers who had evangelical programs on the radio before there was evangelical programs on Sunday mornings. Pat Robertson, for example, got his start the exact same way. So in 1961, Bob Jones University invited radio evangelist Billy James Hargis of Oklahoma to come to Greenville to receive an honorary of Doctor of Laws degree. Now, why? He had been a radio evangelist. He was a hardline segregationist. He called himself a leader of the old Christian right. His motto was, I just want to preach Jesus and save America. So to save America, he founded an organization called the Christian Crusade, not yet Christian Coalition. and hired a young man in 1957 named Richard Viguerie to help him raise money. Anybody recognize Richard Viguerie's name? Brand new, right out of college, hired him to help him raise money through direct mail. This was a brand new idea. Where I send you a letter in the mail, a solicitation letter, and say, here's what I'm about. Don't you want to support what I'm about? Can't you throw some dimes in the kitty here? So he developed this direct mail database to solicit small donations, an average of 2,000 mailings per day. When the average contribution to his movement was $4, average contribution was $4, but $4 from each of 250,000 donors, then it starts adding up. He was raising $1 million annually. That is why Billy James Hargis became Dr. Billy James Hargis, thanks to Bob Jones University. And late that year, after 4 years of developing this direct mail system, Viguerie left Hargis and became executive secretary of a conservative youth group called the Young Americans for Freedom, founded by William F. Buckley Jr. Anybody recognize that name? William F. Buckley Jr. All of these things come together. And strangely, they come together through South Carolina. All right. 1961, the General Assembly enacts a system to award state grants, quote, state grants of $200 to parents who choose to enroll their children in private schools. You know who they're talking about. In 1961, in August, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia ruled that the Prince Edward County Grant and Aid Program was unconstitutional. And why was it unconstitutional? Because it was based on race. All right, now this is exciting. What happens in 1962 on April the 14th? U.S. Representative Floyd Spence. Anybody here from Lexington County besides me? Lexington County. Floyd Spence of Lexington County, South Carolina, announced, now this is 1962, announced that he was switching to the Republican Party. Lifetime Democrat. Announced he's switching to the Republican Party. This is a congressman. He's sitting in Congress. He's holding a seat in Congress. Having become, he said, uncomfortable with the National Democrats' increasingly liberal platform. Well, what had been increasingly liberal about it? Except now we had to integrate public schools, right? He also opposed a loyalty oath required by South Carolina Democrats to support the Democratic presidential nominee. Think about this. Democratic Party in South Carolina now required in 1962 a loyalty oath that said, if you are a loyal Democrat, I swear to support the Democratic nominee for president in 1964. And Floyd Spence said, I don't know who y'all are going to nominate for the presidency to be your nominee. And it could be somebody like JFK again. And I don't want to support somebody like that again. So I oppose that. I'm going to switch and become a Republican. His party switch, think about this, 1962, y'all, made him the first Republican to serve in either the House or in either house of the state legislature since Reconstruction. I'm sorry, I said Congress, didn't I? This is the State House. Since Reconstruction, the first Republican since Reconstruction.
Where he was my Republican U.S. congressman when I was in college.
He became yes, exactly right. He jumped up. All right.
And I didn't think you could find somebody stupider than Floyd Spence to take his place, and they accomplished it with Wilson. That was amazing.
All right. I'm not going to repeat that for y'all.
I digress.
Zoom in. All right. In 1963, what happens? After an amazing and an entertaining, that I did not include in here, debate and argument on the Senate floor in South Carolina, Harvey Gantt was allowed to enroll at Clemson. It sparked a furor on the South Carolina Senate floor. They were quoted, and then they claimed, and when I say they, I mean Mary and Gresham, claimed to have been misquoted in the Saturday Evening Post, which was a national publication. Saturday Evening Post published a feature on Harvey Gantt enrolling at Clemson, and some people were quoted in it, and then some people said, I was misquoted in it. Y'all can't say this about me. Gantt's enrollment marked a symbolic end to relying on legal and legislative means. Those were the 1950 strategies to prevent integration. They had failed to prevent integration through laws and the courts. The segregation committee's efforts to use community support now to establish private alternatives kicked into high gear. In 1963, the legislature approved a tuition grant program for enrollment of students in private schools this time without referring to race. Without referring to race. The act made no reference to race. It said the program's intent was to give, listen to this, and see if it's familiar to you, freedom of choice. Freedom of choice, that's the language in the bill, to parents. Also, the legislature closed all 26 state parks after a federal court ordered state parks facilities to be integrated. This is 1963. What did state parks have in them back in the 1950s and 60s that every little child liked to go and enjoy in the spring and summer? Pool. Did you say pools? Yeah. Swimming pools. They had swimming pools in them. And when the Supreme Court said in 1962 or 3, you got to integrate all of your public parks, your state parks, South Carolina said, we're not going to have these children swimming together in these swimming pools. And so they closed all of the state parks. And what happened to the swimming pool industry starting in 1963 in South Carolina, and not only in South Carolina, but across the South? If you have flown lately, when you take off from Columbia or you take off from Charlotte in any airplane and you look out the window, what do you see? What do you see?
Like a swimming pool.
Swimming pools everywhere. Everybody's got a swimming pool, all these little blue dots all over the place. Why? Because before the 1960s, there weren't swimming pools in backyards. You can go to the local municipal pool. After 1963, we're not doing that. So just a footnote on the equalization stuff. Under George Bell Timmerman, who was governor from 55 to 59, more of the equalization funds were approved to build white schools. That continued under Timmerman's successor, who followed George Bell Timmerman as governor. I know some people in Zoomland will know this off the top of their heads. It was Fritz Hollins, became governor of South Carolina from 59 to 63. By 63, the amount that had been spent on school construction totaled now $214 million. Roughly 54% went to white schools and 46% to black schools. In 1963, Charleston County School District became the first school district in the state to fully integrate public schools. I wish I had made that a quiz question before showing you this slide. Which was the first school district in the state to fully integrate? It was Charleston in 1963. In 1964, the state funded tuition grant program for private schools drew more than 1,000 applications statewide. One of them came from Marion Gressett's own niece, his brother, Dr. James H. Gressett, to pay for the private school tuition of his unnamed 15-year-old niece down in Orangeburg or Calhoun County. So again, we're taking care of ourselves. We're passing laws to take care of ourselves here, our own families. In 1964, when the proposed Civil Rights Act of 64 came before the full Senate for debate, the Southern Bloc, BLOC, the Southern Bloc of 18 Southern Democratic senators and one lone Republican, anybody know who that was from Texas? John Tower, led by Richard Russell, Democrat of Georgia, launched a filibuster to prevent passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64. Richard Russell from Georgia said, "We will resist to the bitter end any measure, any movement which would tend to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of the races in our states." Strong opposition to the bill also came from still Democratic Senator. What date is this? March 30, 1964. Still Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond. Quote, "This so-called civil rights proposals, which the president has sent to Capitol Hill for enactment into law, are unconstitutional, unnecessary, unwise, and extend beyond the realm of reason. It is the worst civil rights package ever presented to the Congress and is reminiscent of the Reconstruction proposals and actions of the radical Republican Congress." Note the date, March 30 of 1964, Democrat Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Then what happens in July? It is enacted. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements. It prevented racial segregation in schools and public accommodations and prohibited employment discrimination. July the 2nd of 1964. Oh, then what happens in September of 1964? This is just a segment of Strom's televised speech. Televised. He gave, if you read your study guide, you know that in 1959 it was, I think, South Carolina owned all of the public television licenses in this state. So when Strom said, I got a speech to give to the people of South Carolina, he said, come on, Strom. In a televised speech to all South Carolinians Democratic, Senator Strom Thurmond announced his endorsement of Republican Senator Barry Goldwater for president. This is just, 2 months before Election Day in 64. And he announced he was changing his party affiliation to Republican. Floyd Spence had done it 3 years earlier. And he saw that no harm had come to Floyd Spence. Floyd had paid no political price for switching parties. Floyd was successful at it, so I must be too. He was the first Democratic member of the U.S. Senate to switch parties. His speech marked the beginning of the modern Republican Party's overt appeal to Southern white conservatives. In this speech, and newspapers printed the entire speech, so it fills up an entire page of the State, for example, or the Greenville News. He makes no reference in this entire speech to civil rights or to race. What he says instead is the Democratic Party has abandoned the people. It has turned its back on the spiritual values and political principles that brought us the blessings of freedom under God and the bountiful prosperity, etc. It has repudiated the Constitution. It's leading us into a socialist dictatorship. The Democrats have encouraged, supported, and protected the Supreme Court in a reign of judicial tyranny in the court's effort to wipe out local self-government, effective law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, when do we get the socialist dictatorship? That's slow walk too.
I'm waiting to see it. All right. Brett asked, when are we going to get this socialist dictatorship? All right. In 1964, another small tangent, the IRS declared that Dr. now, Billy James Hargis' involvement in politics violated the terms of the Internal Revenue Code for religious institutions and therefore withdrew the tax-exempt status of the Christian Crusade. Until that point, it had been tax-exempt. All this dollars that he got from people watching, listening on the radio, and sending their dimes back through the mail, he would have to pay taxes on it. And then in 1965, now Congressman Albert Watson was stripped of his committee seniority because he supported Barry Goldwater. This was a Democrat who supported Barry Goldwater, the Republican, in the 64 election. So when Congress came back to town in January, what happened? Albert Watson, congressman, was stripped of his committee seniority. So he resigned from office and announced his affiliation as a Republican. He filed to run for re-election to his seat in the special election, and he won. Isn't that nice?
That was the last overtly racist campaign I've called South Carolina.
Is that right? In 65? There you go.
Well, it's when he ran for re-election. He's got a twin. Somebody called his twin campaign against him.
Ah, I see. And you see there in the photograph with it, when this was published, you see there who is his mascot and mentor. All right. Now, remember a decade earlier in 55, Jimmy Burns went to the, or 54, Jimmy Burns went to the segregation committee and said, hey, hint, hint, y'all, white parents might take their children out of public schools and put them in private schools. Well, by 65, those white parents decided we need an organization to make this happen. So they created the South Carolina Independent School Association. Representatives from 7 communities met in Orangeburg at the invitation of a wealthy local businessman, T.E. Wanamaker, cousin to Senator Marion Gressett. Isn't it amazing how all these family ties keep popping up in South Carolina? To organize SCISA, Wanamaker hired a recent UNC graduate, Tom Turnipseed of Mobile, Alabama, to serve as its executive director and help him organize private school committees across South Carolina with business leaders and church leaders using Wanamaker's own model. Wanamaker opened in Orangeburg a place called the Wade Hampton Academy. Anybody heard of the Wade Hampton Academy? When they would graduate seniors at the Wade Hampton Academy, they would give them these little lapel pins that were the Confederate flag, Wade Hampton Academy. So the goal was to accredit, this organization's goal was to accredit segregation academies to qualify for these tuition grants. So Wanamaker and Turnipseed presented private school development programs to civic organizations, church organizations. You call them to come and make a speech to your group, and they'll come. Parent groups. The purpose was to organize private school committees in all of these counties. In Orangeburg, the Wanamaker branch of the Gressett family donated the land where the Wade Hampton Academy would be built. They raised the money to build it and to hire the staff. For the next 2 years, every new school segregation academy that was organized used the Wade Hampton model as its model for organizing, fundraising, building, and its curriculum. And they grew rapidly. Anybody here from Sumter tonight? You may be familiar with the Thomas Sumter Academy. In Aiken, it's called the Aiken Preparatory School. In Charleston, the College Prep School, Miss Mason's School, and the East Cooper Private School. In Colleton County, the John C. Calhoun Academy. In Barnwell, the Jefferson Davis Academy. There's nothing in Barnwell, but they had the Jefferson Davis Academy. And in all, Tom Turnipseed helped in opening 43 segregation academies during his time with this organization. 22 years later, he looked back on it and he said it was the terrible damn thing, the worst of all the racist things I did.
Professor, let me speak up in defense of Tom Turnipseed.
Yeah, I was going to defend him too.
There's no proselytizer for something other than somebody that gives up something, like somebody that quits drinking or quits smoking or quits being a stone cold racist. Yeah. Turnipseed was George Wallace's national campaign manager, was that 64?
And for the presidential campaign, I think that was 68.
Yeah, I don't. But he grew up in Alabama, cousin of Morris Dees. That's a whole other story.
Right.
But that Turnipseed became one of us back at Grove when we were at Grove, and he had a big time epiphany. Decided he was wrong and been evil. He started. It was like 40 something. Yeah. White flight. We call them white flight or segregation academies during his very short tenure, like 2 or 3 years, and then went on to work with his cousin Morris Dees in Alabama to bust the Klan here in South Carolina. They shut down the main branch of the Imperial Wizards here, and I don't know, in the 80s. Mm-hmm. But Tom, this class that we're having now, this is the 11th year. Tom, before he passed, would come with his wife Judy and talk about these things that he did. And so this is not ancient history, y'all.
Right. That's exactly right.
And
yeah. And he was elected to the South Carolina legislature, and while there served as
a senator,
what we would call one of the most liberal members of the state legislature. Yep. While he served.
Yep. No, I remember him smoking some reefer, going in and arguing that abortion should be legal, and he almost carried the day. He was amazing when he got screwed up.
Don't tell everything. All right. Don't tell everything. All right. So in 65, SCISA organizes in Orangeburg, and you see this Dr. T.E. Wanamaker, the founder of Wade Hampton Academy, with this famous quote that was published in the newspaper. The public school system as we knew it, who are we? I would argue he's talking about white people. As we knew it is dead. In this article that was published in the State in Monday of July of 65, they quote a dentist from Hemingway, a fellow named Thrailkill. He said, there was no racist motive for establishing a private school. There's no racist for little white children. The main purpose, this is a quote, is to give the white children freedom of choice. There's no racist motive. It's just to give white children freedom of choice. We feel it's a necessary step to prevent what would be chaos in the next 5 years if the races mix freely in our schools. The school age ratio is 70% Negro and 30% white. Not that I didn't do well in math, but I think 70 is a majority in a democratic society. We're a majority. Not too many of us, we like this community and we don't want to move away. Not too many of us are going to change our feelings because of some state mandate that says we have to, he said. That was Thrailkill's quote. I mentioned Richard Viguerie a few minutes ago. He obtained from the U.S. House Clerk's Office a list of every person who had made a contribution of $50 or more to Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign in 64. It was 12,500 names. That became the basis for his new conservative donor mailing list. He opened, and it was public information. You ask the clerk's office in Capitol Hill for this information. It's public information. Any one of us could have done exactly the same thing. He opened a direct mail fundraising solicitation company and began signing up right-wing clients, including Strom Thurmond of South Carolina and Jesse Helms of North Carolina, Ron Paul of Texas, the National Congressional Club and the National Right to Work Committee. He asked for no salary. We didn't mention that it was in 1954 that South Carolina passed its right to work law. We talked a couple of classes ago about unionism and why unionism struggles in South Carolina. 1954, South Carolina passed its right to work law. He asked for no salary. That's what the right to work law says. You got a right to work for less without unions helping you. He asked for no salary, but a percentage of the funds that he raised. So if I raise you $1, Just give me a dime of it. And when you're raising millions and millions, that turns into money, plus ownership of all of their own internal mailing lists. So if Strom Thurmond signs up as a client, he gets Vigory's support, but he also turns over to Vigory his own campaign fundraising lists. And the same with Helms and Ron Paul and all these other folks. In 1965, what happens in the middle of the year? The House passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. All 6 of South Carolina's members of Congress opposed it. Y'all know what ESEA did? ESEA was the first federal public education law, the first federal public education law. So funding comes through the ESEA from the Department of Education in Washington. It just passes through the state at the state level and goes into school districts to cover all kinds of things. Later, it would include the school lunch program, for example, from the Department of Agriculture. Special education programs all come through ESEA. As it was originally drafted, ESEA was set to be renewed every 6 years. And so for the first several times it was renewed, it just kept the name ESEA, 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 ESEA. But then presidents started naming it different things. So by the time, I don't even remember what Clinton named it. I don't remember what Reagan or Bush 1 named it. But by the time you get to W, you may remember a law called No Child Left Behind. That was his name for ESEA. It's the same bill, just with all kinds of changes enacted inside it. And so that was ESEA. Passed in 1965. And nobody in South Carolina supported. None of South Carolina's members of Congress.
What did ESEA stand for? What was that?
ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. The Senate passed it by 73-18. Senator Olin D. Johnston voted for it. Senator Strom Thurmond voted against it. You can speculate for yourself why he did not support it. ESEA established a federal role in guaranteeing rights of public education to every child through 6, what it calls titles. It's chapters, but they call them titles. And those titles were expanded, Title IX, Title 11, et cetera, over time. In 1966, the Gressett's Segregation Committee is still working, although they're running out of steam. At their recommendation, the General Assembly exempted school children. Think about this. Picture this in your head. Exempted school children who were aged 14 to 16 from legislation that was raising the legal driving age to 16 if they drive other students to school. So say I'm 14 years old. The legislature is raising the legal driving age in South Carolina to 16. But if my mom and dad gives me a car and I'm driving my friends down the road to school in the morning, even though I'm 14, I'm exempted from that law and I can drive. What was the purpose of this? This was a way to get around riding integrated school buses. Y'all think about that.
When the private schools didn't have as much buses. And so,
that's true too.
And us private kids had cars.
That's right. Private school children had cars.
I had my car when I was 14. I could ride.
You did?
Yeah.
I had a tractor. I didn't have a car.
Well,
all right.
South Carolina.
And a boat. I had a little boat. Not a big boat. Oars, not motors. All right. In 1966, but I digress. 1966, and I know I'm running short. The Segregation Committee dissolves quietly, not by any act of the governor or the legislature. They just stop meeting, which is why we can't tell when they go out of business. The only documentary evidence that you can find about the Segregation Committee, besides their media coverage and their private correspondence, are the 7 interim reports that they published. And these interim reports are just short little thin documents, maybe 6 or 8 page documents that contain recommendations for the legislature to adopt. Gressett himself later claimed that the committee was dissolved at his request in the early 1960s, but there's no documentary evidence to support that claim because the committee kept no minutes of any of its meetings, its closed door meetings. It's unclear when the committee dissolved, sometime between 66 and 68. And if you go looking for any more information than this in Gressett's own papers in the state archives, you're not going to find it. Gressett's collection is a very paltry collection. It comprises less than 1 file box. Now, if you've ever been to the state archives out on, what's the road? Out in Northeast Columbia, or you've been to the Caroliniana Library,
Park Lane.
Park Lane Road, and you've asked for the papers of some particular person, you've got to be specific because the papers can fill dozens or hundreds of cubic feet of boxes. One box, one box. It's almost like somebody scrubbed clean before they turned his papers over. I don't know if that's what happened, but it's almost like that. In 1969 and 70, here's the second example that I mentioned to you of ideas that were conceived here but born elsewhere. In Holmes County, Mississippi, is that where Grenada is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Holmes County, Mississippi, 3 segregation academies applied for tax exempt status as charitable institutions under the IRS regulation, and a group of Black parents in Holmes County sued to prevent that approval. They argued that the enrollment policies were discriminatory and violated IRS regulations for tax exempt status. These schools had been founded in the mid-1960s, just like here, in response to public school integration. In 69, the first year of integration, the number of white students enrolled in Holmes County public schools dropped from 771 to 28. The following year, that number fell from 28 down to 0. No white students enrolled in Holmes County public schools in 1969. So in 1970, plaintiffs in this Mississippi case won a preliminary injunction denying tax exempt status to segregation academies until further review. Later that year, who was president at the time? Richard Nixon ordered the IRS to enact a new policy denying tax exemptions to all segregated schools in the United States. I know you're saying, what? Nixon did this? Yeah, Nixon did this. Under the provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 64, which forbade racial segregation and discrimination, discriminatory schools were not by definition charitable education organizations, so they had no claims to tax exempt status. And donations to these organizations would no longer qualify as tax deductible contributions, so you can't write them off at the end of the year. In 1970, which school districts in South Carolina are the very last to integrate their public schools? In March, it was Darlington County. Darlington County Public Schools led to the integration order there led to protests and violence in a town called Lamar. Anybody been to Lamar? Where a group of almost 200 white adults, these are adults, white adults, attacked and overturned a school bus full of Black children. Over 3,000 of Darlington County's white students had boycotted school for weeks before this white mob attacked the school bus. You see a picture there of the school bus over on its side. And then in June of 1970, by the end of that school year, public schools in Greenville were the last to fully integrate by court orders from separate cases. So if anybody asks you which was the first to integrate, that was Charleston. Which was the last to integrate? It happens to be the largest school district in the state, Greenville County School District. In 1970, the IRS sent a letter to Bob Jones University and asked, do y'all discriminate on the basis of race? The school responded defiantly, we do not admit any Black applicants. You can call it what you want. So in 1971, in June, the U.S. District Court of the D.C. Circuit ruled in the Mississippi case, Green v. Connolly, and upheld its IRS policy. Under the IRS code, racial discriminatory private schools are not entitled to the federal tax exemption provided for charitable education institutions. And that included one Bob Jones University. Bob Jones argued at this. He said racial segregation was mandated by the Bible. Did you not hear my sermon from April of 1960 something or other? But the Reverend Jerry Falwell and Heritage Foundation co-founder Paul Weyrich framed their opposition in terms of religious freedom. We have the freedom to do this because the God gave it to us, not any law. For decades, evangelical leaders boasted that because their educational institutions accepted no federal money. We don't take any federal money from Caesar, and therefore you can't tell us what to do. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 changed that. Anticipating negative reaction from this decision, Bob Jones University admitted one Black part-time student who worked in its radio station, and he dropped out after a month. In a second attempt to prevent IRS action, Bob Jones University admitted married Black students to the student body, but out of fears of miscegenation, vocabulary word for the day, they refused to admit unmarried Black students. Bob Jones University also stipulated that any students who engaged in interracial dating or who were associated with organizations that advocated interracial dating would be expelled. All right, that closes Bob Jones for the moment. What happens in 1972? In 1972, in the spring, they unveil a statue up on the, northeast corner of the State House complex, a statue to Jimmy Burns. Unfortunately, Jimmy Burns didn't live long enough to see it. He died just a couple of months before the statue was unveiled. Read the slide from my note to myself says, read the slide about Eisenhower. Something about Eisenhower. Oh, Burns's views, I see it now in the middle of the article. Burns's views on school integration caused him to break with the Democratic Party, and in 1952, he supported Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower instead of Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson. So that was his break. He didn't become a Republican. Apparently, he remained a Democrat, but he broke with the Democratic Party. Fun fact, before Jimmy Burns's monument was placed on the State House complex, the last monument to have been placed on the State House complex was the statue of Pitchfork Benjamin Ryan Tillman. And at the event in 1940 or 40, it was 1940, at the event at 1941 to dedicate that monstrosity, the keynote speaker was Jimmy Burns. Jimmy Burns. Everything comes back around. In 1973, y'all ever heard of Lee Atwater, a product of South Carolina? He attended Newberry College, I think, but did not graduate from there because he was too big. Newberry couldn't hold Lee Atwater. And so Lee Atwater got involved with the National College Republicans and managed the campaign for chairman of candidate Karl Rove. Lee Atwater in 1973 gets involved in the National College Republicans, meets a fellow from Utah named Karl Rove, and says, "You make a good a chairman for the National College Republicans." Rove lost a controversial vote count, and he appealed the case. He lost. But Lee Atwater and Karl Rove appealed their loss to the chairman of the National Republican Party. Y'all know who was the chairman of the National Republican Party? A man named George Herbert Walker Bush. And George Herbert Walker Bush decided that Karl Rove had won, even though he did not have a majority of votes. Segregation academies. Prior to 1956, there were only 16 private schools in South Carolina. Between 63 and 75, almost 200 new private schools were created in the state. In some of the more rural, majority Black counties in South Carolina, these schools enrolled more than 90% of the white children in the public school system. In 1979, the State House complex was graced with a brand new Senate office building. And when they looked around to decide who to name this brand new Senate office building for, they'd already named something for John C. Calhoun, Edgar Brown, Solomon Blott. They'd already put up a monument to Jimmy Burns and Pitchfork Ben Tillman. So they said, I can think of no better person to name this brand new Senate office building after than the man who fought tooth and nail to protect segregation in South Carolina, Senator Marion Gressett. And so that is why when you go to the State House complex today and walk in to greet your senator, you have to walk into the Senate office building and walk past a bust of this man. Over the objections of, I should point out, over the objections of conservatives in Congress and in the Senate, including Strom Thurmond, also in 1979, President Jimmy Carter signed legislation to elevate the U.S. Department of Education to a cabinet-level agency. Did y'all know Jimmy Carter did that? Jimmy Carter did that in 1979. And then in 1984, this man stayed in the Senate until he died. Marion Gressett died while in the Senate, and Lee Atwater rose up. Now, I told you that you would see this sentence again on the very first slide I showed you. Now you have all the information you need to finish the sentence. The state of South Carolina is willing to do anything. That means pass or repeal or break its own laws. It's willing to pay anything. That means higher taxes or fees or private tuition. It's willing to change anything, even the Constitution. Abandon anything, even their party affiliations, to preserve the order of segregated white supremacy, no matter how long it takes.
That's it?
That's it. It said stop there, so I stopped.
All right. Any questions for Cecil? There is one in the chat already.
Yeah.
The question goes a little like this. So, was the lost cause doctrine leadership a part of these same groups, but also making sure that they had these independent schools? So I think it's kind of asking a question about how the lost cause kind of plays a role in how they think about these schools and all that.
Well, yes, in an indirect and a direct way. Yes, because the lost cause ideology inspires this notion that we have to protect South Carolina and its purity at all costs, but also in a direct way, in that when you look at the mascots of these segregation academies, you find people like the Rebels. I think Jimmy. Oh shoot, which is the high? Well, there are a number of high schools that are the Rebels, and as I said, at Wade Hampton Academy for many years, they gave out little lapel pins to graduates that were the Confederate flag. I think with the word liberty or the word victory written over the Confederate flag. When Nikki Haley was in high school, Wade Hampton Academy was combined with Wade Hampton Academy. Either a K to 8 school was combined with a 9 through 12 school. And together they became the Orangeburg Preparatory School. So the first year that it was an Orangeburg Preparatory School, that was Nikki Haley's last year in school, and that's the school she attended. So her graduating class may have been the first one not to get those Confederate flag pins when they graduated from the 12th grade. So in those ways, I would say directly and indirectly, yes, the lost cause ideology inspired and informed the move to move white kids to private school segregation academies in South Carolina.
I see Sumter has her hand raised too.
Oh yeah, yes, Mr. Sumter. Yes, Mr. Felder. I mean,
yes. The people you talked about tonight, Jimmy Burns and Gresson, I had personal experiences with both of them. Jimmy Burns came to Sumter in 1952, addressed the American Legion Post 15, trying to promote his 3-cent sales tax. I was a 14-year-old serving water and coffee to that group. Later on, I was at the unveiling of his statue on the State House grounds 20 years later when I served in the legislature. Marion Gresson. Marion chaired the committee that Saul Blott appointed to do redistricting or to do reapportionment. I served on that committee with Marion Gresson, and we were able to get the House into single member district, but it took 15 years to get a Black in the Senate because of Gresson. Just thought I'd share that with the body.
I appreciate you every week, Mr. Felder.
Yeah, I have a question. What about students that did not fall in the white or black category at this time? You know, you mentioned Nikki Haley.
Yeah, she's an
Nikki
excellent example.
Randall.
She's an excellent example in that she could sort of choose where she wanted to go. What I would speculate is that minority families who had means could persuade, so long as they abided by the rules, written and unwritten. And if those families crossed the unwritten or written rules, then they would probably be invited to go somewhere else.
One more question. Did no white families support their children going to school with Black children? I mean, that blows my mind.
Yes, yes, because Mildred, oh, what was Mildred's last name? Who was part of the integration of Charleston
High School.
Yes,
Yes, 1963.
she talked about white children. Millicent Brown talked about the white children whose parents were fine with them going to integrated schools.
Okay, some of those numbers sound
So there
like
were.
I guess certain counties.
Well, it's not the kids, and that's part of the job.
Right.
They get the kids first if they control the schools. So that's one of the things we need to do. But Dr. Green, we're about out of town, but let me just pick up a through line here. People asking about the lost cause and wasn't it kind of obvious? No, not if you're a fish, you don't recognize water. The kids, and see, Fairfield County is a good example. It's the majority black county ever since. It's 62% now. They've got one high school that stays about 98% black, 99% black. They've got one white flight academy, the Richard Wynn, that's where the Winsboro came from, academy, that all the politicians so far that have served and led Fairfield County, majority black county, all of them are white, and they send themselves and their kids to the segregation academy. But you see, that's the way it is. That's the culture. That's what people are used to. That's what we're fighting. It's what Modjeska said, what's bred in the bone can't be beat out of the flesh. We just have to outlive some people. That's one of the things.
I see Loretta has her hand raised. Go ahead, please.
No, Cecil, that was a great presentation. I just look at it, in spite of the black-white thing, where does South Carolina stand in terms of literacy?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. Excellent point to make.
But I mean, it was against the law to teach people that were black to read.
Well,
And
we're talking about
yeah,
all
but-
people.
Right, but we have the Supreme Court has said we have minimally adequate education here. We have a banner that says Southern by the grace of God, stupid by choice. Because it is popular thinking that people we're keeping stupid are the people we want to keep under our control. And that's the white working class as much as the black.
Right.
Well, when you look at the fact that Mississippi has made this phenomenal turnaround, it's shame you feel really ashamed. You used to be able to say, if not for Mississippi, you can't say that anymore.
Right. Pendleton?
Can you talk about Rosenwald schools?
Rosenwald schools, yes. In the early 20th century, I'm thinking 30s and 40s, but this is not an area of my expertise. The Rosenwalds was a Jewish family who contributed a great deal of money to fund the building of schools, particularly for minority students across not just South Carolina, but across the South. And I don't know what the application process was or what it looked like, but I know that there are at least two Rosenwald schools that I know of. One is way up in the tip of Richland County, right? Or is it over into Newberry County? And then there's one over to the west of Lexington that still exists. The buildings still exist.
There are a number of Rosenwald schools scattered around South Carolina. And there's one in Columbia, Piney Grove Road. But look it up. You'll find them in your neighborhood. Go see them.
Yeah, Rosenwald, Rosenwald, Rosenwald schools.
And I'm putting something in the chat about those Rosenwald schools in relation to South Carolina. I know we're just about out of time, but there is one last question to chat for you, Cecil, that I think kind of sums everything up for this evening. Chris Cottingham. He wrote, "This all seems very overt and blatant. Has it always been this way, or has it been somewhat deliberately hidden? I was born in 1973, was taught in school that segregation ended in 1954, and didn't learn about segregation schools until 2010 in my late 30s. Then I researched my home county in Georgia and learned that it wasn't actually integrated until 1970, the year that the private school opened. But this was brand new information to me. And I'll say the personal note, my mother, also from Georgia, didn't go to integrated schools until 1970 as well." So could you respond to that?
Whose question was that, Robert?
Chris Cottingham.
Yes, it is overt. And I think part of the overtness of it is because at the beginning of this process, it was believed, at least among white elites, not just here in South Carolina, but across the South, that they would prevail because they were right, that they would prevail on all of these legal issues because they were right, not because they were in the majority, but because they were right. And I think it came as at least early in the process, it came as a shock to some and a deep offense to others that they were losing in the federal courts. And once you've staked yourself out to a position in public, it's hard to back away from it, you know? So if you argued in the early years of this process that segregation is right because it's right, then it's hard for, and especially if your mama and daddy are staking that position out on behalf of your family in public, then as you grow into young adulthood, you know as well as I do in the South. Earlier in the presentation, somebody said abolition of white supremacy was an unforgivable sin. In the South, it is an equally unforgivable sin to oppose your mama and daddy in public.
Mhm.
So this goes right along with what Brett quotes Modjeska Simkins saying, what's bred in the bone can't be beaten out of the flesh. And it's why generation after generation after generation continues down this regressive road, because my mama and daddy was right on this. My grandmama and granddaddy were right on this, and you can't tell me otherwise.
Well, and don't deny that there's privilege involved.
And there's privilege. That's right. Economic privilege and racial privilege are involved as well.